Welcome to the lecture on science philosophy. It's a big word, science philosophy or research philosophy, triangulation, mixed methods. Um, Someone from philosophy would say you could make a whole model out of it, and that's true. But I think it's necessary to understand the frame where you do research. Without the frame, a lot of things do not seem to make sense. All those debates we have in research between qualitative and quantitative methods, all the debates about induction, deduction, all the debates we have of different methods, of mixed methods and how to mix methods. So I will present you the frame here, and that has certainly philosophical aspects, but it has also some practical aspects, and that explains why we name the subject business research methods and what research methods we are going through actually mean, because the methods itself are the smallest element of research. It's not research itself, it's a small element of research. If you see the terms here, you see the term methods, you see the term methodology, you see a sophisticated term that's epistemology, which is difficult to pronounce, and you have the term ontology. And that all are used for research, but on a different hierarchical level, I would say. Methods, it's directly what you use for research methods. So let's say you do a study among university students in Berlin. We have 3 big universities. There are together more than 100,000 students. You cannot ask all, so you have to draw a sample. And drawing a sample is one of the methods you use. So you can use different samples. You can make a simple random sample, which might be biased because at TU Berlin, for instance, we have many more male students than female students and many more bachelor students than master students. So taking a simple random sample could be biased. So you think about doing it in another way. You could take a stratified sample, so you say, okay, I look at the years the students are in. So I take a random sample out of the first year students, a random sample out of the second year students, a random sample out of the third year students. At least then you have an equal sample on the study years of the students. Or you take a clustered sample, you say, okay, I take random 10 modules from TU Berlin, 10 modules from Free University, 10 modules from Humboldt University, and I take all students within this modules. So there are 3 different strategies to sample, and that are your sampling method. That's one method. Then, of course, you need research instruments like surveys, or you do structured interviews, or whatever you do. That's also a method. How do you gather the data? You can do it in very different ways. The third is, how do you analyze the data? So if you want to compare groups, female, male students, or students between TU Berlin and Humboldt University, you probably do a test, a statistical test comparing groups like a t-test. If you want to predict, for instance, you want to know whether students at Humboldt University are more happy than students at TU Berlin, you would take a more predictive method and you would use a regression analysis. And that are all the single methods you do when you do research. And normally, you think before you do your research about the set of methods. Together, the entire set of methods you use is your methodology. So that's sampling, research instrument, that's like a toolbox. So you take some tools and then you have your toolbox for your research. That's methodology. Sampling, research instrument, analytic tool. In qualitative analysis, you might also in quantitative analysis, you might also choose software doing that, supporting you. So that are all the methods. Then you have this methodology. And this methodology, of course, it's part of the bigger frame, and that's your research, which starts in finding a research problem, a gap, a relevance, why you do this research, why we should know whether students are more happy at TU Berlin than, or other way around, at Humboldt University than at TU Berlin. So that's where you start out your research. You have to explain to the audience why it is relevant what you do. Second is that you mostly go into theory if you do deductive research, or you try to create theory when you do inductive research. So that all up to conclusions you draw in the end and interpreting your results, that's your epistemology. That's just the building. First you have this set of tools, then you have your toolbox, then you have a building. But that's your building, that's your study. There are many studies out. We have in social science maybe, I don't know, 6,000, 7,000 scientific journals publishing every quarter or twice a year. So you have many, many studies that are published. And that all is a community, a family of research done. And I displayed it here with a town. So your small house is part of a very, very big town of people doing study. And that's your ontology. That's actually your contribution on knowledge or new knowledge with your research study. And in this way, you actually can distinguish these terms and you can use these terms. Your study itself has an ontology. You have your contribution. But it's also has an epistemology because it's let's say, a consistent thing from relevance theory, methodology to conclusion. It has a methodology, a set of methods, and you have selected the methods you use for actually creating the knowledge you create. That's the general setup. Okay, about induction and deduction. That are the major lines. It also are in mixed methods. We will come to that. You have them in a sequence. You start with induction and go to deduction, or the other way around, and you have them in longer sequences. Induction means you don't know much about a certain area. There are no really theories explaining. It's rather new. You have to go in and actually explore. Mostly you use qualitative methods for that because you cannot standardize your measurement instruments. And your aim is not to test hypotheses. Your aim mainly is to create hypotheses. To do something in theory building by creating hypotheses, which will have to be tested later. But you're not testing this hypothesis, you're creating hypotheses when you do induction. But the precondition for doing induction is that it's a rather new field. So we don't know anything about it. I mean, there are many fields where we know a lot. There, induction is not necessary because we already know a lot. Deduction is a different thing. There we already have done mostly plenty of research. Or we have done research in another field and we transport this field to a new phenomenon. But at least we have some theories and some empirical results from prior studies which actually allows you to already formulate hypotheses, what you expect, what you have in mind. A hypothesis is actually what you expect from doing this research formulated. And when you test that, you're actually not testing what you have in mind, you test the contrary. It's a null hypothesis. That's what statistics do. You have actually to reject the contrary what you have in mind to accept what you have in mind. That's actually the logic of statistics, but we will come to that. But that's deduction. You formulate your hypothesis and you gather data and you test this hypothesis. To give you some examples. A new field in the field we are in, innovation, entrepreneurship, sustainability, is crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is a quite big term for many things, crowd investing, crowd donating. What we don't know are the mechanisms behind it. When you want to present a project to a public and you want to raise money in whatever way, we actually don't know why certain people give money to certain projects and not to other projects. It's a mixture of presenting, it's a mixture of the topic you present, it's the mixture of the audience on these different platforms. So there's a whole thing around it. It's pretty complex, but we don't know that. That would be a typical topic, not investigating it theory-driven in a deductive way. That's a topic that should be better investigated on an inductive way. To either gather more and more knowledge about the mechanism, to be able to formulate a hypothesis. That would be a typical research, because we don't know much about it. We don't know about the mechanism. We have to go into in a probably explorative, qualitative way. The same as probably this, I mean, you realize it, everyone knows that it is hard for many enterprises, for entire countries, to switch to a sustainable transition. And what we see now massively in a gray zone, in a very dark zone, it's a kind of greenwashing. It's also scamming, actually, cheating on numbers and what you present, up to what's already in this corporate social responsibility. It's often used as excuse for corporates for the actually unsustainable behavior to do something good next to it. So that all mix will come in the next 10 years massively, because it's hard for companies to change, it's hard for countries to change. It's even hard for public organizations and institutes to change. So what will happen? We speak as long as everything looks nice. And it is the mixture of scamming, greenwashing, and we sell it as corporate social responsibility. So we don't know much about it. And many things are in a gray zone, because many things are based on facts that at the first glance seem to be good and right and sustainable. At the second glance, it's not. I give you one example. I mean, when you consider in your mind companies being engaged in chemical industry or energy sector, they have a dirty image, don't they? Somehow. But if you have companies in the digital sector, they don't have that, but they're in the same way dirty. So it's actually your impression on that. I mean, they have bad working conditions, they use a lot of energy, they actually outsource production into countries with cheap labor. So there are many, many facts, and they use a lot of resources of seldom or rare materials. So there are many, many facts that actually shows that all the digital industry, it's probably even more unsustainable than other industries. But in our mind, it is not. And so you have many, many things that are transported, that are into, let's say, that gray zone, which is unexplored. And that actually needs also inductive research to go really into that, because we cannot approach it with a deductive thing. We cannot standardize it. We don't have the instruments. We don't know much about it. We don't know much about all the tricks played by marketing and imaging and branding to us that we accepted. I mean, they actually play with very smart methods in manipulating behavior, in manipulating minds, in marketing efforts. So there are many, many things that need to be explored. We cannot do it in a deductive way. Another thing that's very old. Actually, that's the example. We have done 50 years of research on how do I assemble successful teams, or let's say a successful startup team. How do I do that? And we have developed, consultancies have developed many, many approaches towards that, but nothing works. So we don't know. The only thing which has been proven empirically is that blind dating works. Larger companies in research development, for instance, have the opportunity with thousands of employees to make blind dating session, because after 30 seconds, people know with whom they can work and whom they like and whom they don't like. And how that works, we don't know. I mean, our mind is giving us a message, okay, I don't want to go with this guy. Or giving us a message, I like this guy, interesting, I would like to go with this guy. We don't know how it works, but it works. That's the only method that really works, but it needs a lot of effort to put together teams. I mean, I cannot, when we do startup and entrepreneurship at TU Berlin, I cannot organize a blind dating session of all 35,000 students. Would be nice to have that, and maybe you even would like that, but it costs too much effort. So that's a typical thing where we have done research for 50 years, but we don't know anything. And it also asks for more inductive research. Another research is, for instance, terms as human capital or social capital are very often used in scientific literature. And there is plenty done the last 100 years. And it is, of course, very well proven that some human capital, which means what your social environment where you grew up and your parents have given to you, at norms, at behavioral settings, at expectations, at knowledge, at all that has been offered. That's actually part of your human capital you have got from your family. And you have a social capital, you have a network, you have people supporting you, you have friends. So this human and social capital is actually helping you being successful. And we can show that empirically. So people who miss that are not as successful in their life and not as happy in their life as people who have more of that. And that's a typical deductive question. If I would ask about happiness of students in Berlin, I would use human social capital as one of the variables explaining why people are happy and why some people are not happy. Another is keeping to the topic sustainability, comes from games theory. It's a so-labeled volunteer's dilemma, which is a slight modification of the prisoner's dilemma. That is, the original situation is we have an accident on the street, and there are 20 people around. Every one of those 20 people wants to help the guy emotionally, so should be helped because the guy is injured. But nobody does, because that means investing in it, getting dirty. Maybe the guy is dying. It's not good when I do that. I don't know what to do. So nobody does anything. And that's a typical volunteer's dilemma. And the same we have for sustainability. The country who moves first towards real sustainable transition loses the economic advantage. So, why should we lose as Germany economic advantage, where we are building on our economy to have a certain wealth, to have a certain standards here, which should not be lowered down. So we won't move, at least not more than other countries move. And if all countries behave like that, this injured guy, nature, is lying there without any help. And that's a situation which we actually can model quite nicely using games theory and game theoretical approaches in giving really payoff structure through it. So in this way, we can actually theoretically explain in a quite easy way why nobody does anything. Another example is research we have done for years now, for, I don't know, 15 years, explaining. And that's not a causality, because we cannot claim a causality, but explaining why people in social networks are more creative than others. And actually what we can show in school classes, among hairdressers, we have researched that among medical doctors, among students, among blogs, we have done a lot of studies. People who are between groups, betweenness, that's the social network term. We also have a session about social networks here, or social network analytics. People who are between groups are seemingly more creative than other people. It could be that they are more creative because having more diverse information all the time and having more control over this information by being between groups. It could also be that the people are creative by nature, because I cannot say something about causality, and they position themselves between groups. So actually, when you look at social networks always are a big picture of some clusters, so groups, and you have lines between groups and you have people between groups. You can test it yourself. Are you part of one group and that are your friends and there's not much around it? Or are you part of many groups? You're from a former school, from your hometown, from whatever, you do music, you do sport, you go out dancing. There are all different groups, and when you are situated like that, you're actually in between many groups. That you can measure with social network analytics. And because we know that, we don't have to explore that. We can actually easily come up with a hypothesis that people that are between groups show a higher creativity than other people. So that are typically examples of that thing needs to be explored, that's inductive, and that thing needs to be tested because we know already enough that we can formulate hypotheses. Next to this deduction, you have this debate about qualitative research and quantitative research. It has a long debate There are some researchers in social science that favor qualitative research for many, many reasons, for also good reasons. Then researchers who favor quantitative research, that's for instance me, I rather have real numbers and data than all the qualitative interviews, but that's a matter of also socialization in research, and there's a debate what more accurately and better measure things. Of course, when you explore, more qualitative research is required, because you cannot standardize, you cannot make an experiment, you cannot make a questionnaire, you cannot because a questionnaire means scales, so I have to standardize. So I cannot do that. I will need more qualitative research. If I know a lot, and if I can standardize things, and if I have scales I can use, I can do it in a quantitative way. But nowadays, I think the difference disappears, because we are more and more working with methods and algorithms to also quantify qualitative data. If I do gather data on a World Wide Web, textual documents, whatever documents, or I make a movie, I record you, or I make photos, I all can quantify that. There are a lot of software doing that for me. So, and I also could actually qualify quantitative data. This difference between really qualitative and quantitative is disappearing with new methods coming up with artificial intelligence and data science. So the whole debate will disappear. Still, you would go more on a qualitative side when you do inductive research, and more on a quantitative side when you do deductive research, but the difference as such is disappearing. So, from a philosophical point of view, you have two extreme viewpoints or perspectives that also belonging to the vision on qualitative, quantitative research, inductive, deductive research, and that some people, also as me, are quite on a positivistic side. That say, I believe that almost everything can be measured somehow and objectively measured, whether your happiness or whatever can be measured. That's one view. That's like coming from natural science, like in physics, chemistry, biology. The people believe everything can be measured. But in social science, it might be a bit more complicated, because you also have this as examples from a constructivistic point of view that say the social life or the social site we have is socially constructed. So that's made up in our mind. It's nothing that can be objectively measured. It will differ from people to people and from country to country. A good example, this researchers always uses the example that a frog is talking to a fish, and the frog tries to explain how the animals on land look like. And he's explaining to the fish there's a cow, and the cow has 4 legs, and the cow is black-white, and the fish tries to imagine this cow. But still, this cow in the view of the fish looks like a fish. He has never seen something on land. So for the fish, it's socially constructed, what he actually imagines. Another thing is what science really can show you, it's color. That people in different countries and from different cultures see color in different ways. What I see as green has not to be green in some countries in Asia. It could be blue. The same with red. So it's actually, it differs. And this example show how difficult it is to measure something, to standardize measures, and to ask people on a global scale the same questions in a standardized way. So constructivism makes a lot of sense when you study internationally, when you study globally, and it also makes sense to think about it, that certain things are really hard to measure, because people have different opinions about it. I came across that in my own research when I was trying to study friendship in working groups. Because the definition of friendship differs very much among every individual. I easily defined it as this time, that are guys, you do something also outside of the work context. Yeah, but some people would not consider that friend, can still be acquaintance. I go in the cinema, I go whatever, doing that. How much emotionally bond is involved to call someone a friend, and that differs from people to people. So it shows that's socially constructed. Your individual term of friendship is socially constructed, and therefore constructivism makes sense, and both sides make sense. I also believe that we have some norms and values we all share, that the majority of things can be measured because we share them, but there are also differences and things cannot be measured. But you have to keep in mind that there are these two groups of researchers in social science, the more constructivistic side and the positivistic side. In the middle would be the realism. That are people who take both sides into account and try to find a research way which accepts both sides. So in this way, positivism would be more heading towards quantitative research and deduction, because we think we can measure everything. We use questionnaires or whatever, we quantify everything, put it into a number, use statistics. That's the positivistic side. That comes more from natural science. So like physics, chemistry, biology, they do it in this way. And then you have the constructivistic side, which more uses qualitative research, instruments like interviews, also observation, and tries with their methods, triangulation, to come up to results. That about the frame of research we are in. At business research methods here, we try to touch both. I mean, the quantitative side, it's much bigger, and 80% what is published is more on the quantitative side, but we also handle the qualitative side here because I think it's important and maybe even increasingly important. When you engage in science philosophy, you're not avoiding to meet this guy, Karl Popper. That's probably the most famous philosopher in science philosophy, and he is strictly on the positivistic side. So he says science only covers deductive research. When we can formulate hypotheses and we can test hypotheses, we can build theory. But he's also criticized. But when you look at research, you find terms as grounded theory, system theory, that are all labeled theories without being able to test them. A system theory, Luhmann, it's not testable. Actually, according to Popper, it wouldn't be any theory. The same as grounded theory. It's not testable. It's all and everything. It's not testable. You can discuss about theory building in a way that you can say, okay, that's very strict. It's very positivistic. And he does not take into account the constructivistic view on that. And we might extend that, because also theories can be built up in, let's say, very fuzzy theories. And system theory, and for most grounded theory, is a very fuzzy theory, which does not lead to clear hypotheses. But social science is so complex, and it has a field that cannot be clearly measured. We should be generous and extended towards that. That's my personal view. It's a debate in philosophy on both sides. What really is science and what isn't science? And Popper is one most famous one, but one being really strictly on the positivistic side. If you see it in disciplines, you see that the more nature science are really positivistic. They don't accept anything else. And that many science, as social science, also engineering, it can have both sides. I mean, in engineering, a lot of things are about design, about functionality. A lot of things are irrational, but have to be done, or it's nice to do that. So they are also on a constructivistic side. Social sciences anyway, and humanities also very much on a constructivistic side. So actually you have these broader disciplines, and we are a social science discipline. We are on a broader scale. And the natural sciences that are also at TU Berlin. Does someone study from you in chemistry, physics, mathematics? You could do here as well. You don't have to, but they are more on a positivistic side. So, and at most, very good studies, you have both sides. You have a deductive side, an inductive side, you have a qualitative, a quantitative side, you have a constructivistic side, you need it, and you have a positivistic side. And one of the studies, and that also leads to triangulation and mixed methods, and one of the studies, it's an older study from the 30s, the Marienfeld study. There, a team of social researchers studied a small town in Austria where the biggest employer went bankrupt. So all people in this small village were unemployed suddenly. And they studied their behavior in many, many ways. They made surveys, they made observations, they made documentation. They even were looking at the street and measuring how fast the people work. But they actually realized that the speed of working was slowing down after unemployment. It got slower and slower and slower. So the whole village was working slower. And there are many, many facts turned out of that, how the people's behavior changed with this unemployment. And a lot of methods were around, used, qualitative, quantitative methods, also inductions, deduction in a sequence of developing questions, of developing hypotheses. So that's actually a good mixed method study done. When you do qualitative studies, the most important thing is actually when you do all studies, let's put it also to quantitative studies, it's triangulation. That means you have to accept that when you do it alone as researchers, you hardly can be objective. It's really hard. When you do interviews or you're in a topic, I mean, when you have a hypothesis, it's really hard to keep objective because actually you want to see the hypothesis confirmed when you do research. Otherwise, you wouldn't go for it. So you cannot be objective. And therefore, there is something as triangulation. And triangulation means that we maybe use different data confirming the same. And that's this using qualitative data, quantitative data, different studies, doing observation, doing survey, and coming up with the same results. I did it, for instance, I was measuring social networks of kids, of school kids, 7 years old, in school classes. So it's hard to measure them by a survey because with 7, 8 years old, it's really difficult to fill in surveys. They can do, but you never can be sure whether it's correct there or whether you can use it. So what I also did to record the classes during lectures, where they had lectures where they could speak to each other and solve problems with each other. To have two kind of data pools to see the networks. And that correlated quite highly with 0.7, 0.8. So the recordings from the camera and the survey we did was actually pretty the same. So I could confirm that are the networks because I used the triangulation method with two different methods. And when you have a research question, it's always important and good to have different data sources to solve that. And that's triangulation by data. In qualitative research, you can also have triangulation by investigator. So that not only you do the interviews, other people do the interviews and analyze the interviews too. And interviews are analyzed in a way that you code the text you have, that you compare these codes before you actually come to conclusions. And triangulation means that several people do the same. And you would expect that having the same material, that the same people come out with the same codes and the same interpretation of the data. And that's triangulation. If that is the case, you can be sure that the knowledge in the data, in the interviews, are the right one because everyone draws the same thing out of it. That's investigator triangulation. And you have triangulation by methods. You also can analyze interviews in a textual analysis, in a content analysis in different ways. So you can use different methods coming to the same results. And the same thing you can do with statistics. You can compare groups, you can make predictions and relationships between variables. You can have relationships between whole sets of variables. So if you apply different methods to the same data and they come to the same results, you also have a method triangulation. Another important thing is the theory triangulation. That's more difficult, and it only works with deduction, because then you already have a theory. Let's take, for example, data triangulation, investigator triangulation, triangulation of methods, triangulation in theory. Explain behavior in social networks. So you could actually use 3 theories to come up with the same hypothesis. And the 3 theories in this way would probably be when you have the question, why do people behave, for instance, the same way, or why do you leave the room after the end of this session? You could be still sitting here, and that can be explained by 3 theories. And one theory would be transactive memory theory. You know each other, you understand each other without talking to each other. If someone heads to the door, everyone will follow. So you have a kind of transactive memory because you are all students, you probably know each other, you know how you think, how you behave, you know the norms and values here, you have the same interpretation of behaviors of others. That's the transactive memory, therefore you leave the room. You can also explain it by proximity theory. Because you are all here and you are close to each other and the session ends, because of this proximity here, you leave the room together. It's maybe not the best example. But also you can use contagion theory, which means contagion that, like a virus, spreads from person to person, that your behavior actually spreads here. Someone is leaving and it's contagious and then all leave. So actually you could use 3 theories to come up with the same hypothesis. And that would be triangulation by theory, which is also a possibility to triangulate your research. You can also triangulate on different ways. You can triangulate by investigator theory, methods, and so on. You don't have to choose one. Another example, why have groups the tendency to be lazy? It also can be explained. There's even a theory about groupthink that says as longer are groups together, as more uncreative and lazy they get. And there's an easy way to explain that. And one way is social exchange theory. In the beginning of a group, when you don't know each other, you exchange showing performance by showing performance, that you are good, that you're performing well, that you know a lot, that you're a smart guy. So you actually exchange performance. But when you know each other much better, you start to exchange laziness. So you avoid each other by not doing anything in a group. It's pretty easy, much easier than the performance thing in the beginning. So you actually not actually punish yourself when someone is lazy. No, you reward each other by being lazy. And groups have a tendency towards that. That can be explained by social exchange theory. You also have social cohesion, closeness theory, which is somehow the same. When you are in a close group, when you know each other very well, you feel very well, very happy. You don't need to perform anything. So actually, you could explain the behavior of groups in the long term by 2 different theories coming up with the same hypothesis. And that would be triangulation on theory. So what I said, you have also triangulation in mixed methods, and that can be done in different ways in a sequence from inductive methods, of qualitative methods to quantitative methods, or the other way around. It can be done in a longer sequence. The typical thing is doing induction before deduction and doing actually the explorative step before. But I also have done it in another way around, that you first have a quantitative study which leads to a certain result, and then you in-depth go into the result. For instance, the part about being between groups and being creative. It's fine to know, but you don't know the causality behind it, and you cannot really measure the causality behind it. That only can be explored on a qualitative phase, so I would put an inductive research after a deductive research. But really well-made studies nowadays use both, because we are in a social science and we have to deal with very complex phenomenon that we actually need both sides, creating, exploring inductively things and also testing things. I mean, things that are well known can really be tested and should not be approached qualitatively. And two of the studies next to the here, next to the Marie Tau study, you have the Hoffman studies in innovation entrepreneurship. That's a very big study done in the United States in the end of the 20th last century. And that were studying workers over years, how work groups were forming, how they were behaving, why people were leaving, how they felt. So it was a longitudinal study with all methods possible, documentation, surveys, observation, and that done in a sequence from inductive and deductive.